Why hello there, and welcome back to Let's Make Us a Character. And in this episode, we'll be diving into the not quite grimdark world of Warhammer. Now, you might be thinking, "Oi, didn't you already do Warhammer?" And no, I covered Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, first released in 1986. But this time we are going all the way back to 1983 and looking at the very first entry in the Warhammer franchise, Warhammer, the mass combat fantasy role-playing game. That's right, the mass combat fantasy role-playing game. While to this day the influence of role-playing games on Warhammer is fairly evident, back in its very first release, it even ostensibly was one. And from a modern perspective, it is very interesting to look at the tangled history of war games and role-playing games, and specifically how one evolved into the other, and then in this case, supposedly back again. Because while Dungeons & Dragons Rules for Fantastic Medieval Wargames campaigns playable with paper and pencil and miniature figures can retroactively be called a war game with role-playing game elements, role-playing games were not really a thing when it was made. It was just a variant skirmish war game. But Warhammer came out at a point where war games and role-playing games had become two distinct types of game, and chose to identify itself as the latter, to say that it was a role-playing game with mass combat rules rather than a war game with role-playing rules. Which is of course why I am covering it on this role-playing game-focused series, which does also mean that I will be looking at it from a more role-playing game-focused perspective, ignoring or glossing over some things that are more relevant to the traditional wargame implementation of the rules, and looking at this in a way that will be more familiar to a role-playing game audience. So with that out of the way, let's make us a Warhammer mass combat fantasy role-playing game character. Warhammer was released as a box set containing 3 booklets: Tabletop Battles, which contained the main combat mechanics, Magic, which covered magic, and Characters, which contains the character creation rules that I am about to explain. To begin, each character has 3 sorts of characteristics: personal characteristics, fighting characteristics, and skills, which make up the character's profile. And as I sometimes do, I will be going in a logical order rather than the order that the book does, because despite clearly laying things out like this, they then do not present the content in that order. So first, personal characteristics, which are the additional player character characteristics from the characters book, which are not used for standard non-player characters. Yeah, that was not confusing at all. And in something of a rare occurrence here, we will actually be making 3 characters at once, since each character is fairly simple. So first up, race, the options being human, dwarf, and elf, and we roll a d6 for that, and wow, 1 of each. What are the chances? Like 2.8%. Then a d100 for social status, and free man, noble, and free elf. Not gonna make the joke. Then age, which is 66 plus 6 for humans, 10d6 plus 20 for dwarves, and elves getting off easy with 3d6 plus 20. So 26, 57, and 32. Then alignment, the options being good, neutral, evil, avarice, and hunger, with the only restriction being that all elves must commence their careers as good, so let's just say neutral, good, and good. Then intelligence, which is 1d10 for men, 2d6 plus 2 for elves, and 2d4 plus 4 for dwarves. So 6, 9, and 7. Cool, which is equal to 2d6 with a -2 penalty for dwarves, so 8, 6, and 7. Willpower, which is 1d10 for humans, 2d6 for elves, and 2d6 plus 4 for dwarves, so 8, 11, and 3. And Leadership, which is equal to a d6 divided by 2, rounding down, which the dice math nerd in me must point out is not a d3, that would require rounding up, with bonuses for having sufficiently high social status, which none of these characters meet. And 1, 3, and 1. I'm starting to get a feeling about who might be the leader of this group. So those were the personal characteristics, and now on to the combat characteristics. Move, which is typical for the character's race, and considering how many of the rules are printed multiple times in these books, it is a little odd that for some reason they couldn't have just done that here, instead of making you go all the way back to the first book. So 4 inches for men, 3.5 inches for dwarves, and 4.5 inches for elves. Then weapon skill and bow skill, and we must choose if each character is going to be primarily a melee or ranged character, or as they put it, a swordsman or a bowman. And let's just say that our human and dwarf are melee, and the elf is ranged because elves do tend to be shooty boys. Then we roll 2d6 to determine each character's primary fighting skill level, and elves get to add 2 to that roll if bowmen, so 3, 5, and 3. Then roll, I believe, a d6 minus 2 for secondary weapon skill, and 1, 2, and 1, which does seem really low, but also is the only thing that makes sense based on the text. Then strength, which is rolled with a d6 with 1 set of values for men and elves, and a second for dwarves, and 2 all around. And toughness, which once again has separate values for men and elves and dwarves, and C, C, and B. Then wounds, which are basically hit points, and all characters start with 1. Initiative, which is rolled with a d4, plus 1 for humans, and plus 3 for elves for 2, 4, and 5. And number of attacks, which is also 1 for all characters. And those are the combat characteristics, so now, skills. And each character gets 1d4 minus 1 skills, so 2, 0, and 3. And then we roll for each skill, and the man thing has Forger and Jeweler, and the elf, Sailor, Trapper, and Pickpocket. And I feel like I would be remiss if I did not point out that one of the skills is transvestite, with no further explanation, which is just an odd choice for a number of reasons. And finally, equipment. And each character starts with a number of gold pieces equal to 1d6 times a multiplier determined by social status. So 3, 20, and 30. And some characters also get some automatic equipment. Specifically, a human knight will automatically own a full mail armor suit, a broadsword, a lance, and a horse. All dwarves will own a suit of mail armor and a hand weapon, and elves will automatically have a sword and bow with arrows. So, rolling knight on the human social status table would have been very convenient. And the monetary system here is in pre-decimal British units, so 1 gold crown is equal to 20 shillings, and 1 shilling is equal to 12 pennies. A thing that normally I would complain about, but am willing to give them a pass for 2 reasons. This game is from the UK, and also 1983, and if you were playing this game in the UK in 1983, it would be not only possible, but likely that you would personally remember using pre-decimal British currency. Yeah, for those of you who think of pre-decimal British currency as being this old-timey Sherlock Holmes thing, they only switched in 1971. It's literally referenced as being a thing that happens in the future in the first episode of Doctor Who. So our dwarf gets free chainmail and a free hand weapon, and let's just go with the least interesting option, a sword. Then we'll add a shield for 2 crowns, a 2-handed hammer for 4, and a crossbow and quarrels for 5. Then our elf gets a free sword, bow, and arrows. Unfortunately, it is not specified what kind of bow, and there are 3, so let's just split the difference and say longbow. And then let's just blow all 30 of our crowns on some armor with a U. And last, but certainly least, our human. And with 3 crowns, we cannot even afford a boring old sword. So let's just get a mace, short bow, and arrows. And with mail armor and shield, our dwarf has a saving throw of 5, and the elf with just mail armor, 6. And with no armor, our human has no saving throw. And of course, that is a thing I will explain later. Then in a final and optional step, if so desired, we can designate a character as being a wizard, as long as they have intelligence of at least 5. And looking at our characters, I think our human could use a little help, so let's just say that they are now a wizard, which means they need some additional attributes. Wizards have a constitution score equal to their willpower plus 2d6, so 17, and life energy of 1d10 times 200 for humans, and 2d6 times 200 for elves and dwarves, so 1000. And all wizards start at mastery level 1 and begin knowing 1 spell, and let's just go with the old classic, Fireball. And then, just for convenience, these characters should probably have names, so, I don't know, Wizzo, Bob, and Fago. And these characters are done. And as usual, that means that it is time to discuss mechanics, and I guess a bit more of how this game is arranged. So, obviously, as a mass combat role-playing game, the focus here is on combat, and in fact, if you just want to have a standard PvP wargame experience, you don't even need the character book. The Magic Book even provides an alternative method for generating constitution for non-player wizards. And honestly, that book is kind of optional too if you decide not to use magic. Even the rules for exploring and fighting in dungeons, which have a decidedly role-playing game feel to them, are in the Tabletop Battles book. So, what is in the character book that takes this from standard wargame to mass combat role-playing game? Well, there is of course a basic introduction, mainly to the concept of the players versus game master dynamic, those character creation rules I just covered, character advancement rules, and some additional combat mechanics that I will discuss later, a section on creating adventures with that wealth and equipment section that I kinda looked at and isn't actually necessary for the main game because the base rules basically just say that whatever a model has is what that character has. Then some random encounter tables and a sample adventure. And yes, that sounds like a full complement of role-playing game rules. Until you realize that I never said anything about non-combat mechanics. So, if we look at the skills, some of them have specific rules, some have vague rules, some have no rules, and one just gives you a bonus to cool, but there's never any kind of, skill check mechanics. But what about intelligence, cool, willpower, and leadership? Those specific player character attributes that we had to roll up for the specific player character rules. Surely they have a function in the game's mechanics? Well, not really. Aside from willpower being used to calculate constitution and needing intelligence of 5 or higher to be a wizard, the only rules provided are that maybe you could use them to arbitrarily modify an arbitrarily assigned percentile roll. And I will say that those personal characteristics were given more function in the combat mechanics in later books, but just in general, despite being generated as part of the roleplay rules, they don't really factor into those rules in any meaningful way, because there really aren't any. Which is weird because this was 1983. It's not like attribute checks were an unheard of idea at the time, which also makes the specificity of some of those scores really weird. Like, how do you decide that humans have 1d10 intelligence, elves 2d6 plus 2, and dwarves 2d4 plus 4 without having any kind of context or framework for what those numbers mean? Like, based on that, every dwarf qualifies to be a wizard since they have a minimum intelligence score of 6. Was that intentional? Is there some reason why dwarves have the highest minimum intelligence? Or are all of these values just kind of random and meaningless? I kind of assume the latter. However, as mentioned, I am looking at and presenting this as if it were a role-playing game, as that is the focus of this channel and series, and also what the game says it is, so let's look at those combat mechanics through that specific lens of this being a role-playing game. And let's say that our 3 characters have descended into a dungeon and encountered 9 orcs, 6 armed with spears and 3 with infantry bows, and all unarmored just to make the explanation easier. Which means that it is time to talk about units. Now, if you had zero familiarity with wargames and I asked you how many units are on the board right now, you may very reasonably say 12. But that is incorrect. A unit can be a single character, or multiple characters who act together. So the 9 orcs are actually only 2 units. 1 unit of 6 spearmen, and 1 unit of 3 archers. And for reasons that are going to be very apparent later, I am actually going to attach Bob to a unit of stock dwarf NPCs, armed with hand axes and no armor, once again just for my convenience. So regardless of how many little guys are on the table, there are only 5 units in play right now. And just to make things simple, I will be referring to an individual part of a unit as a figure. So this is a unit made of 6 figures. And with all that sorted, it is time to begin, and combat is broken into a number of turns consisting of 6 phases each, with the active player switching each turn. In a standard game. However, in this scenario we have 3 players and 1 game master, so rather than switching between 2 players, the turns switch between players and game master. So players go first, and phase 1 is movement, where all units of the active side may move. So Bob and his dwarf squad move as a single unit, and as dwarves can move 3.5 inches, which is not enough to engage the orcs. However, since they intend to move into hand-to-hand combat, they can charge, doubling their movement up to 7 inches as long as it is towards the enemy, which is sufficient to bring them into contact with the unit of spearmen. And of note right here, basing. You may notice that the figures have different sized bases, and that is part of the rules. Dwarves, humans, and elves are supposed to have 20mm bases, and orcs 25mm. And if you are used to grid-based combat, that might seem like an insignificant distinction. But without a grid, it kinda is. While that extra 5mm isn't going to make much of a difference in targeting and maneuvering of a single figure, when placed in units it adds up pretty fast. Such as right here, where the width of 5 dwarves is equivalent to only 4 orcs. So a 5-figure wide unit of orcs is going to be a whole inch wider than a comparable unit of smaller fighters, which can provide meaningful advantages and disadvantages. So dwarves are in position, and Wizzo and Fago are fairly comfortable where they are for the moment, so on to phase 2, the shooting phase, where the active player may shoot with any suitably armed troops. And we just happen to have 2 suitably armed troops. However, units in base-to-base contact with an enemy unit are considered to be in hand-to-hand combat, and cannot be fired upon without risking hitting the wrong side. So they are both going to attack the unit of archers, and I am going to say that they both have a clear line of sight to the lowermost figure, so we'll take no penalty on the roll. So we pull up the ranged 2-hit table, and Wizzo has a bow skill of 1 and Fago 3, which requires a roll of 6 and 4 respectively to hit, and a miss and a hit. So we pull up the ranged weapon table, and a longbow has an attack strength of 3, so we pull up the metal AFly named kill chart, and with a strength 3 weapon attacking a target with a toughness grade of C, we must roll a 4 up to kill, or rather wound them. And success. So 1 wound is applied to the unit, and since each figure in the unit only has a single wound, 1 wound equals 1 kill and 1 figure removed from the unit. Which might make you realize that, oh no, all of the characters also only have 1 wound, and yes they do. But now we move on to the combat phase, where all units in base-to-base contact engage in hand-to-hand combat. And even though not every figure is in contact here, the units are, so all figures in both of those units are considered to be engaged. Also, as far as I and any reasonable person is concerned, these figures are touching. And if you are the kind of person who would argue that, that's the reason nobody wants to play games with you. And combat occurs in initiative order, so Bob has an initiative of 4, plus 1 from charging for a total of 5, and the stock dwarves and orcs both have an initiative of 2, but the dwarves also get that plus 1 charge bonus, so they are 3 and the orcs are 2. So we pull up the melee 2-hit chart and compare the attacker and attackee's weapon skills. And Bob's weapon skill of 5 versus the orc's 3 is a 4 up to hit, with plus 1 from the charge and success. So now we pull up the melee kill chart, which is identical to the missile one. As I said, a lot of things are reprinted. And strength of 2 versus toughness grade C is a 5 up to hit, which he does. So 1 wound, 1 kill, and 1 orc removed from the unit. Then the other dwarves attack at initiative 3, and their weapon skill of 4 versus the orc's 3 requires a 4 up to succeed, and they also get that plus 1 bonus from charging, and 3 hits. Then 2 versus C is a 5 up, and 2 kills, and 2 more orcs removed. Then at initiative 2, the orcs get to attack. Yes, all units involved in hand-to-hand combat get to attack every round, regardless of who the active player is. So 3 versus 4 is 5 up to hit, and 1 hit with 2 versus C again is a 5 up to wound, and 1 dead dwarf. And this is probably a good time to point out that if a unit has a leader, that leader effectively has plot armor, so as long as there are other figures in the unit, they will always take the hits before the leader does, because the leader is just more important. There are some other rules for challenging the leader directly, but I'm not going to get into those right now. So in an actual game, every player character could reasonably be attached to a unit of troops that, in addition to the extra combat ability, would also help significantly reduce the likeliness of those one-hit kills, which are fairly easy to do with a lone one-wound unit. I'm just keeping the scale as small as possible here for the sake of easy explanation, and providing something that looks more familiar to a ttrpg player audience. And now that everyone has attacked, we need to determine which side won this combat, and at 3-1 kills, the dwarves clearly won, and the orcs are pushed back 2 inches. Then on to the second movement phase, where any unit who did not fight in the combat phase can move again, as long as it does not bring them within 4 inches of an enemy unit. And this basically just saves you from the monotony of having to move all of your units around the table at the rate of 3 to 4 inches every other turn. And I think everyone's in a pretty good position right now, so let's move on to the magic phase, where the magic happens. And as the archers will actually be capable of one-hit killing Wizzo and or Fago next turn, we will attack them with Fireball, which allows the caster to shoot one fireball per mastery level at a unit within 24 inches at the cost of 2 energy per ball. Also, spells have a specified number of required movement phases to prepare for and recover from casting the spell. And Fireball has none for both of those, which is why I made the call that Wizzo could make a ranged attack during the shooting phase and still cast during the magic phase. And honestly, even if it had a prepare time of 1, we had a movement phase between then and now. And yes, that does mean that spells with a time to prepare of 3 or more must be cast over the span of 2 active player turns, giving the enemy a whole turn in between to interrupt the spell. So we pay 2 Constitution and 2 Life Energy, and Constitution regenerates at the rate of 1 per hour, and Life Energy does not. Casting spells just depletes a character's finite life energy, prematurely aging and eventually killing them. And I'm pretty sure the spell just automatically hits with a strength of 2 versus toughness of C, and 1 more dead orc. And since that dropped the archer unit below half strength, they now must make a morale check. So roll a d6, -1 for being below half starting strength, -1 for being within 15 inches of an enemy wizard, and -1 for being under magic attack. I guess magic is really scary in Warhammer. And a result of 3 or higher is a success, so morale has been miraculously maintained. And onto the final phase, Rout Phase, where all routed units on either side kind of flee in terror, but that is none right now, so let's just move on to the Game Master's turn. So movement phase, and the orc spearmen step back up to the dwarves, and the remaining archer moves out to get an unobstructed shot at the other characters. Then shooting phase, and the orc shoots at Fago, and with a bow skill of 3, that is a roll of 4 up to hit, which he does. And an infantry bow has a strength of 2, and an attack strength of 2 versus toughness grade of B is a 4 up to wound, which is rolled, so 1 wound. However, Fago is armored, and therefore entitled to a saving throw against all wounds, and with just chainmail, wounds can be saved against on a roll of 6. And 2 is not a 6, so 1 wound and down. Of course, since it would be very inconvenient for player characters to be dead after a single hit, they do get a roll on the injuries table. And 27 is a light leg injury, which puts Fago out of action for 6d6, so 22 rounds. I'm comfortable calling that the rest of the battle. After which he will suffer a -1/3 penalty to movement for 2 weeks. Assuming he doesn't succumb to the flat-out 10% chance of death, which is rolled upon regaining consciousness. So even with the most severe wound, you do still have 1d6 turns to receive aid before dying. So now on to the combat phase, and because all characters act in all combat phases, that means that once again, Bob goes first. But without the charge bonus, the dwarves and orcs are now both on initiative 2. So Bob attacks and misses, then the dwarves and orcs' attacks are resolved simultaneously. And 2 hits for the orcs and 3 for the dwarves, with both sides getting 1 kill, so 1 orc and 1 dwarf down, making this combat a tie, so neither side gets pushed back. But also, the orcs are now below half strength and must make a morale check. -1 for being below half strength, and -1 for being within 15 inches of a scary, scary wizard. And very fail, so they are routed. And because a friendly unit of at least equal numerical strength breaks and routs within 15 inches, the archer must also make a morale check, and must halt or retreat for 2 turns at the player's discretion. and second movement phase, the spearman cannot move, and the bowman is going to exercise the option to retreat. So nothing to do in the magic phase, then the routing phase, and as the orcs are routed, they must move at full charge rate towards their own table edge, or in a dungeon or comparable situation, directly away from the scene of fighting. So away they go. And just to make things simple for the example, let's say that the edge of the screen is in fact the edge of the table, and troops who leave the table are lost from the game and may not return, so this encounter is over. And characters gain experience points equal to the strength of all opponents slain, with bonus points for opponents of a toughness grade of D or higher. So, in all, 6 orcs were killed, with 2 strength each. And you might be thinking, okay, that's 12 experience points. But no, because for various reasons, we must count and award XP individually. So, Wizzo, Bob, and Fago each killed 1 orc, with the remaining 3 orcs being killed by the other dwarves in Bob's unit, which brings up the question, should characters get experience points for any kills made by other members of a unit under their leadership? And I would say yes, because honestly, experience points are not a reward for the character, they are a reward for the player, and as I said, in an actual game, each character would reasonably be attached to a unit, so it does make sense to award those points to the player who got the kills, even though their specific character was not the exact one to deal the killing blow. So I am going to say that Bob gets those 8 points for the 4 orcs, times 2 because good characters get double XP for killing evil opponents, and Fago only gets 2 points for the 1 orc, but also that times 2 for alignment, and Wizzo gets 2 points for the 1 orc he killed, but doesn't get that 2 times alignment modifier because he is neutrally aligned. However, he does still get to double it because wizards get double XP for killing opponents with magic. And let's just say that this was the entire mission, so another 1d3 times 10 experience points for mission completion. Which unfortunately isn't enough for anyone to level up. Unless some kind of magical experience point granting fey creature were to suddenly appear. What an unexpected occurrence! And with that extra 30 experience points, everyone does have enough to level up. Kinda. In a mildly interesting choice, characters do not have numbered levels, just experience thresholds at which they get specific bonuses, which is unusual because, once again, this is 1983, and it's not like character levels were not a well-established concept at that point. So, as warriors with 50 experience points, Bob and Fago get to increase their initiative by 1 point. But Wizzo, as a wizard, does not. Wizards only advance half as fast as fighters in terms of combat abilities, so won't get that initiative increase until 100 experience points. But wizards also get a second set of specific magical advancements, so at 50 XP, Wizzo gets a +1 bonus to Constitution. So, while wizards do not take any initial penalty in exchange for their magic powers, they do begin lagging in combat ability once you start advancing. And those were some Warhammer Mass Combat Fantasy role-playing game characters. And from the perspective of Warhammer as a role-playing game, it's honestly not very good. Like, overall, it feels significantly more like trying to introduce some light role-playing elements into a war game than it does putting mass combat into a role-playing game, and doing a not great job at it. Like, as much as it pains me to say so, even original Dungeons & Dragons had stronger and better designed elements that we would now associate with role-playing games, and did so without the benefit of almost a decade of role-playing games being a thing that exists that Warhammer had. And from a modern perspective, it is really interesting seeing Warhammer struggling with its own identity as a game like that. As I keep saying, this was 1983, a point where war games and role-playing games were distinctively different things. And this is very clearly a war game, but for some reason chose to promote itself as a mass combat role-playing game instead of just a fantasy war game, which is an odd choice. And by the time 2nd edition came out, intelligence, cool, willpower, and leadership had just become part of the standard character profile and were actually used in the core rules, with Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay stepping in to handle the role-playing aspect of the game. But fortunately for me, and you if you want information on Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, I already covered that entire series, even the terrible one. And as for the possibility of more Warhammer content in the future, well, if people are interested, I am not against covering the full mass combat rules from this game. I just didn't because it wasn't relevant to the way I was looking at it. And as for the other Warhammer role-playing games, well, I just kind of ignored the old world role-playing games since I had already finished covering Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, and that technically isn't even a part of that series, like, there isn't even a Slayer on the cover. And then of course there is the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 5th edition that I believe is supposed to be coming out this year to coincide with the 40th anniversary. A thing that I have very mixed feelings on because of reasons that I won't get into now, but are the same reasons that I never covered the 2024 Cowards edition of D&D. And as for the 40k role-playing games, here's the thing. I am actually really interested in covering those, but there are a lot of them, and I do not know exactly how they are related, how they fit into the Warhammer universe, and how to best deal with and present that content with the limited knowledge I have of that universe. Also, covering anything related to Warhammer 40k is likely to attract a very specific kind of person that I am not sure I want to deal with. And thank you for watching. If you enjoy the wacky things I say and do, you can follow me on Blue Sky and/or Tumblr. You can also join me live on Twitch, where sometimes things get a little weird. And extra special thanks to my Fightin' Flail Snails, Broken Unicorn, D-Stex, Diablade, Just Dave, Nikolai Snowtail, Puggo, Randy Mulholland, Ramogus, Renee D, Stephen Kramer, Tila Glar, Toshirokuro, and Tyro the Fox. If you want to be cool like them, check out my Patreon or YouTube channel memberships. Two different things that provide similar but distinct benefits. But if you don't want to do that, that's cool too. You can still hit all the lovely buttons, like, subscribe, these other videos that have mysteriously manifested from the ethers, which I am sure are lovely videos that you will also enjoy. And I will see you next time.